So hi everybody, welcome to the Azure On Air podcast. We're at the Integrate Summit and I've managed to grab hold of my really good friend Kent Weare, who's from the Logic App product team, and dragged him in the room at the end of the day because I really want to kind of catch up with him, and we've kept missing each other all day. And welcome back, Kent. You know, we were chatting last year, weren't we? And it was good to catch up with you.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for having me. Always great to chat.
Yeah, so we've got a promise to not talk about golf because we're both crazy about that, and we joked about just having a golf podcast instead. But I think we might have to do that another time.
We'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, we need a golf analogy in here somewhere. That's the best.
Oh, that's the challenge. Yeah. Okay, sure.
So Kent, right? Last year we talked loads about AI, and Logic Apps was just getting started on the AI journey. 12 months later, catch me up on what's been going on, what's changed, what's new, what you're excited about.
Yeah, so I was thinking on the way over here, what did we talk about last year at this podcast? And really, we were talking about sort of the beginnings of AI, at least in the context of Logic Apps. And we were talking about RAG, so that was all the rave last year, is the ability to take documents and content and ingest it and into a large language model, and then be able to do retrieval and vector searches on top of it. And it was an interesting sort of experiment or sort of initial step in. And I recall, like, I built a demo that helped you sort of figure out, sort of trouble tickets or maintenance tickets, and like how you might find some similarities, based upon like, hey, what are the trends and things like that. So it's kind of interesting. But as I reflect back, all of those investments before were what we would consider a single turn. So this idea that I send information to a large language model, I get some sort of response, but now what do I do, right? Mm-hmm. So if it's a single shot, great, that's okay. Like, there's some value there, but I think you need to have more of these multi-turn type conversations with the large language model. And I think that really gets us towards agents. And that's something that's new for us this year. And even quite recently, is this ability to create an agent in Azure Logic Apps. And even though we're using some of the same tech in terms of like calling Azure OpenAI models, it's more of this, how do we enable these multi-turn conversations and really multi-turn executions across tools that allow us to accomplish specific tasks.
So if we kind of dumb that down a second, I think really what you're saying is the change was last year we were saying to the AI, tell me something. And this year we're trying to say, do something for me. Is that a good way?
That's a great way to think about it. Because before it was more of like, ask a question, get a response, almost like what we saw with chatbots in some ways. It's just sort of a new model of surfacing content. But it was more around, chat with my data versus now orchestrate a business process on behalf of like my tooling and, think about the opportunity and the outcome and the objective and try to solve a problem.
And I guess that business model can be, or that business process can be so much more dynamic on the back of the kind of agent experience.
Absolutely, because I think when you're doing those single shots, it's more deterministic. It's more of like, this is what I want to achieve, and then I'm going to get a response and I have to react and I have to do that in a deterministic way. Versus with this, it's really more non-deterministic, and it's more of like loosely coupled orchestration.
Mm-hmm. So with the bit you talked about there, then, so tell me about this week. How's some of the things you've told us all about at the Integrate event? How's that going to help customers build that kind of solution? What are the key things people should be watching for?
Yeah, I think we've had the question of like, okay, this is neat, but how do I use this, right? And I think those are valid and interesting questions. And it really comes down to like identifying like opportunities to use agents, and then also identifying opportunities where using your existing workflows makes sense. And so that was some of the things we talked about in our presentations, because we're not trying to position agents as the solution for everything. I know some teams and platforms may try to do that, but we're not naive to think that that's the way people should be going at this. And it's more of an additive thing, like better together. So if we think about concepts or use cases that were typically challenging to solve with integration, largely it related to like unstructured data, right? Or semi-structured data. As an integrator, that was kind of a nightmare, because we have schemas and we have maps, and we have them for good reason. It allows you to be very predictable and consistent and reliable. But that also sort of puts a box around the use cases that you can go solve, because you need that deterministic sort of input in order to drive a process. This is where it's more of a surface area problem in my mind, where we can now go after use cases that historically were difficult to solve. So if you think, I'm sure in your history, you've tried to build an integration where you had to, receive an email from, a partner, a vendor, a customer, and drive some sort of workflow. That was always super brittle because you had to do all of this custom parsing logic. And if you receive something unexpected, kaboom, this breaks and then a manual process kicks off to get it fixed. This is where large language models excel, where we can actually use the large language model to actually impose a schema around the data, to parse the data, to basically summarize the data. It really opens a lot of those particular use cases for us. The other thing that we showed today earlier was also this notion of using knowledge to allow for more dynamic, let's call it routing, inside of an orchestration. So if you think about a business process, historically would be codified, like whether you're writing code or low code, you're basically building out those workflows. We can now leverage documents as well to help drive those business processes. So the idea is what are the building blocks or what we call tools that I need to use to go solve a particular problem? Then I can go describe my business process in the form of knowledge, which could be a wiki. It could be like a SharePoint document. It could be a document 360, content. And we can actually use that to supplement our particular business process and actually have something orchestrated.
So I think that, if we think of the typical integration customer, the obvious thing that jumps to my mind there is rules. When you talk about that use case, it's actually, why do I need a rules engine when I just give the AI some documents about my process, give it some information for context, and then I just call it and it gives me the rules back without me really coding them, kind of thing.
Yeah, I actually had this question yesterday, and it was a great question. And I think there's still kind of a spot for rules, especially when you think about calculations. Large language models typically aren't great around calculations. Think about it this way. If you go into any sort of enterprise business, even small, medium-sized business, right, there's probably some sort of a run book or operational guide that basically dictates how you go ahead and complete a series of steps. It's okay, step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, do another thing. Those are perfect or ripe to be able to then orchestrate as part of one of these business processes, and actually then use the agent, leverage that, and actually sort of drive kind of those steps. And the idea is that you can now have more dynamic solutions, in the sense that you just have these building blocks that will be dynamically just called as needed, versus you having to hardwire everything. And I think that's the opportunity where you've got some level of consistency, but you've got a lot of breadth there, and you don't want to go ahead and code for each one of these use cases, but there's some relationships across them. I think that's really the sweet spot.
So what do you think are going to be the challenges? Say if I want to start building an AI powered integration today, what do you think are the things that I'm going to have as hurdles that you're looking to solve over the coming months?
Right. And I think number one is mindset, right? I think one is, like I said, we're not positioning this as do everything in agent, but sort of do it when it makes sense. And I think people should think about value, number one, because there are costs associated with using a large language model. Number one, you don't want to use it just so you can talk about it on stage, right? You want to actually provide some business value, and you should always start thinking about this as if I introduce this, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and what is the business value I'm trying to derive from it? That's number one. I think number two is people do need to understand that non-deterministic solutions can be a little bit challenging. They can be really flexible, but you also need to impose guardrails. So this notion of governance is super important. And I think it starts with, hey, these are the things I want the agent to do. These are the things that I absolutely do not want the agent to do. And that's a good starting point. And I think related to that, this is where us, being part of Azure, being part of the Azure OpenAI Foundry sort of family suite of capabilities is important, because Microsoft is investing a ton in this area. So whether it's doing evaluation of different models, obviously the ability to host and implement new models, there's a lot of benefits we get from being in that ecosystem that you'll be able to benefit from. And then also I would just say responsible AI and all of the efforts that Microsoft puts into that are things that people now need to think about. It is actually kind of wild if you think about the opportunities with these models improving. Not only can you see better accuracy, but also lower costs just by switching a model. So I think understanding the strengths of models is another skill that people need to think about, because it can have a cost from, this being like highly reliable and sort of, accurate, and it can also reduce your cost just by switching a line of code, or, in this case, switching a line of configuration to point at a new model. So those are skills that people really need to start thinking about developing.
What about, I don't really hear people talk much about performance of the models, and particularly in a logic app case. One of the things I'm wondering is, if I go to an agent-based integration, say I'm processing orders, often customers will have, I want to get the order into my order system within under a second or something like that. Do you think that using an AI agent's going to be able to deal with that kind of latency requirement, or do you see that as being something where you would go back to a traditional approach?
Yeah, no, great question. And actually, this was one of those slides that we talked about in our sessions around guidance. I would say, like, if you are focused on like so many thousands of transactions per second, introducing a large language model in the middle of that is probably going to increase your latency, and you probably won't reach that objective. So I think it comes back to what I said earlier about, like, there needs to be some sort of value in doing so. Now, I would argue that where this kind of the sweet spot for a lot of this AI is when you would historically have a lot of manual processes, right? So if you think about manual processes, those are usually not like time sensitive in the context of seconds. It's usually time sensitive in terms of minutes, hours, days. That's probably more of the sweet spot when we think about agents, is how do we go ahead and reduce those manual efforts in order to sort of drive productivity.
Something like the approval type process where we can throw it out and the AI can decide if it can auto approve it or escalate it, kind of thing, and we just save the time there. But you've got the acceptance, you've often got that call out which has a delay while somebody does something. And so one of the demos we published, and I really love it, is this product return scenario. So it's this idea, like, if you're a retailer and you basically want to efficiently deal with returns, AI can participate in that. Now, there's obviously some tools that really help with that process. So if you think about, hey, I want to basically see an attachment of like what was the product that they're trying to return, especially if they're claiming like, oh, this was damaged in transit, then we can actually use these AI models to say, hey, like, describe what this is, and even like recognize different characteristics, which is like an automated step that a human would have to ordinarily do. Now, the flip side is like, well, gamification. Like, what if people are trying to gamify this situation? Well, that's where we can actually create, as part of our prompts, and kind of like what we consider our policy documents, is like, this is our return policy. If you've returned more than X times within 6 months, then that's a red flag. If this is your first return, if it's perhaps under a particular threshold, it might make more business sense to auto return it than to actually like get a human in the loop. But there's scenarios where that makes perfect sense, like where it's maybe borderline, or maybe there's like just more oversight required. So still do all of this like pre-work of doing all of the research. Hey, they've had no returns in the last 6 months, but this is worth like $1,000. We still want your eyes on this. So you've done all of the pre-work, and then it's more of like this oversight of like thumbs up or thumbs down. Should we accept this return? So I think in the example that you're there going through, one of the things I think people are struggling to get their heads around is some of the terminology things. So just to play back my understanding to you, so let's imagine we've got an order comes in, it hits the logic app, we've got the agent loop calls out to the AI. So for me, when you describe, right, we upload our policy documents, that would really be knowledge we're loading into the AI, so it's aware of things about how we do. And then I guess the agent deciding that I want to escalate this as an exception to a person might call back to the logic app, and that would be an action executing a tool, which might be a call out to escalate it to another person. Is there any other terms that you think people really need to get their head around other than those couple?
Well, those are definitely scratching the surface. When you get into models, there's definitely like more things to think about. Like tokens is one thing. It's kind of like, to use the analogy of kind of like gasoline, it's kind of like what sort of drives your car. It's kind of the way usage of your model is metered, right? So there's a cost associated with so many tokens, and basically that's kind of a unit of billing that people need to be aware of. There's also this notion of like a context window, where it's more of like, you want your agent to have some sort of memory, right? And so if you think about this return scenario, it has to keep track of a few things like, okay, is this a valid return from a packaging perspective? If you sell coffee and they try to return a bike, like you want to be able to remember the fact that it made that determination. It might be, oh, what's my order history? Like I need to be able to sort of think about that. So that's another sort of, I would almost call it anti-pattern, where if you're trying to send too much data to a particular model, you might exhaust that context window, or it might cost you a lot of extra money unnecessarily. And you need to sort of think about that as well. There's also this notion of temperature, which is a value that allows you to like exercise more creativity versus more, I guess, accuracy. And obviously there's a time and place for those. If we're talking about returns, like you probably want more accuracy than creativity. But if you want to do some sort of like content generation, then obviously the creativity is something that
I think that
might want to tune as well.
That might be why my Minecraft demo didn't work very well on yesterday, because I probably had the temperature too high and let it be creative about what it was building instead of just building.
Those are things, another skill, right? Where you want to tweak, and this is where there's like evaluators inside of Azure OpenAI Foundry that allows you to actually have a model, have a prompt, and then like basically see how that actually gets evaluated. And you can start to do some kind of like A/B testing type stuff where you can evaluate across different models and see which is the right solution for you. So
I think we've not got long left. One question I think is really great to ask now, considering how we started this discussion. Let's think next year. What are we going to be talking about next year? Do you think that'll be it? Or what would you like us to be talking about next year?
Well, so I think it's a couple things. I think there's still some like foundational building blocks that are emerging in the industry. So this week, MCP servers was quite important. And just for context, like that is the ability to connect to a variety of different systems or tools based upon more of a standard protocol. I would say inside of Logic Apps, it's probably less of an issue because we have so many connectors that allow this connectivity. But imagine a scenario if you were building an agent like from scratch, like say using semantic kernel, and you don't have all of these connectors at your disposal, and you want to talk to ServiceNow or Office 365 or Teams. You historically would have had to wire up a lot of that yourself as tools or plugins and create that connectivity. This is more of a way to plug in to existing MCP servers. So there's been a lot of news recently just about some SaaS vendors exposing their capabilities as MCP tools. Also inside of Microsoft, there's been like Azure API Management that's been doing some of this stuff too. So that I think is still maturing. There's still changes that are being made all the time, sort of broadly from an industry perspective. But I think we'll probably get closer to like a stable, release where it's just really functional. And I think that's one piece. Another piece would be more of like what we're calling the A2A, which is like agent to agent protocol, which is like, hey, I've built an agent, let's say in Logic Apps, and maybe I want to go ahead and call like a Workday agent that actually is built on the Workday platform. Like, how do I allow for like the integration of those agents and the interoperability? So there's some standards that are emerging there. This is something that even like just Google released like a couple months ago, and then Microsoft and others have jumped all over and said, hey, like this is a good thing just to have this interoperability. So that's another area which I think will be more flushed out, and we'll probably have more of a standard sort of a stance from an industry perspective. And then I would say ultimately where this should lead us next year is more production use cases and more of these like solutions running in the real world that are actually driving real value. So that's what I would expect, because at the end of the day, like we did see in the keynote, Balin, our partner director of PM, was just talking about how there still is a lot of experimentation going on. And yes, you're starting to see more and more success, but I still think we've got some ways to go in terms of like truly this being, no longer being hype or, it's speculative versus like real world and driving value.
I think there's a really, like that 70% figure Balan had. I think there's two sides to that, as well, where one side is 70% didn't go into production, but actually for me, what's really important about Azure is that we can now experiment and fail fast in a way. So let's say we find this cool technology, we want to explore it, and we go, oh, do you know what? It doesn't have legs from a business perspective, so we just get rid of it. And that actually is really how you drive innovation, isn't it? And the ideas that are successful go forward, and the ones that aren't, we hold back for whatever reason.
Yeah. And that's where I think we have a little bit of a plug, have something to offer here, because yes, you might want to explore something from a business perspective, and maybe it makes sense or it doesn't.
Yeah.
But you should be able to determine that quickly. And with, you think about Logic Apps, and you think about low code, you think about all of our connectivity with our tools and our connectors
Great
and our
for
workflows. This is something that you should be able to experiment quickly and very cost effectively. And then, hopefully you do find success and you can iterate on top of it and actually move quite quickly. So that's what we're excited about. This is why we feel we have something really unique to offer inside and outside of Microsoft, and we're super excited about it.
One last question on the MCP server. So APIMs an MCP server. Logic Apps, is that going to become pitched as an MCP server as well, possibly?
Yeah, no, exactly. And it'll be kind of a two-way street. So number one, it'll be, hey, let's go ahead and expose a Logic Apps workflow as an MCP server, because this is something that people should also think about. There's some, say, connectors that kind of make sense to like expose directly. Like, hey, I want to send an email, I want to send a Teams message. Like, those are sort of a one operation execution. But what if you need some level of orchestration? So
or even durability. You want to push it out and then handle it.
Like, one example could be like ServiceNow. So if we think about ServiceNow, and that makes a lot of sense from a MCP perspective, but if I want to create an incident, it's not as simple as one operation. Generally, there's a few operations that take place, right? I want to look up the caller so I can figure out what their system ID is, so I can then link the incident to their name. There's another use case around, what's the team I want to assign this to, the assignment group. That's another lookup, right? And it might have other lookups as well. So it's more of like creating an incident actually becomes a little bit of a workflow, not just an API call. And I think that's where we have something unique to offer, because we can do more rich functionality, not just like create a ServiceNow incident that has very little data in it, and now someone manually has to go update it. Like, that's not going to work well. So I think, that's kind of one angle. And then naturally, if other people, expose MCP endpoints, and from Logic Apps, you want to leverage that as a tool, I would imagine us being able to support those use cases as well.
I think when I listen to a lot of the way you're describing things, to me, there's a really interesting pattern evolving that I think I remember John Fancy was talking about this a few years ago, about the way we'd sort of break up Logic Apps, where quite often people build one giant Logic app that does everything, but actually if we make more composable child Logic Apps and we plug them together with an orchestration over the top, I think when you describe the MCP model there, that you're really like reusing a unit of work around ServiceNow integration, but actually the agent model again is reusing these smaller unit of works, and it really seems that we're moving more towards that reusable service as a workflow, and then the layer on top, which can either be a traditional Logic app or an agent Logic app or an MCP server potentially, which is quite cool.
And that's actually one of the guidance we put out there is like, the more kind of decomposed your architecture is, the more you're going to be able to leverage existing investments today, right? And so if you've done exactly what you've mentioned about having child workflows, and obviously Logic Apps with like sort of this app kind of concept where you can have many workflows as sort of more of a bundle, this makes perfect sense. And this is another reason why we feel very strong about our offering, because these are things you can do today, right? You can get started. You might have assets and workflows and custom connectors and custom code that you can already plug into an agent and really feel like people can get started quickly.
Supercharge AI. Thank you for joining us, Kent. It's been really great. I'm going to have to watch the recording next year to see what we talked about, so we can compare notes and
it'll be
see how it goes.
There will be change, right? That is
definitely.
guaranteed. That's one thing we know for sure. There will be change.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you.